It was 1967, a year of national pride, as Canada and its people prepared to reach the Century Plateau. It was a year of many celebrations and events, none more grandiose than Expo 67 in Montreal. Canada's birthday, the excitement of a World's Fair, and a deep interest in heritage led to talk of an expedition of historical proportions. This would become known as the Eastward Ho Canoe Trip. The Eastward Ho Canoe is now here at Westminster Quay on exhibit with some pictures and some panels to tell the story of this trip. The canoe, the 4 people that paddled it, and the 3 people that made up the land support party traveled over 4,000 miles from New Westminster to Montreal as part of Canada's centennial celebrations in 1967. This program is dedicated to looking back to that tremendous adventure. The program is also more than that. The program is looking at pride in Canada, in pride in being a Canadian. When these people went across Canada 25 years ago, they found that Canada was a family, a very closely knit family. People wanted to take part. Stay with us now for the next half hour as we look back at this adventure, an adventure that truly was a New West journey. Over the past 25 years, the New Westminster waterfront has seen many changes. Back in 1967, when the Eastward Ho Canoe paddled away from New Westminster, there was no Westminster Quay, and Skybridge did not tower over the Fraser River. At that time, it was a different Canada as well. Patriotism was running high as the country was about to become 100 years old. As I mentioned, much of the celebration centered around Expo 67 in Montreal. It was this World's Fair which was to become the destination for the Eastward Ho Canoe, as its crew paddled it upstream over countless rivers and carried it overland during grueling portages. It was a trip which took longer than expected and was much colder than hoped. But after 3.5 months and over 4,000 miles of Canadian wilderness, the team's goal was achieved. The idea of crossing Canada by canoe came about through discussions of early Canadian history between Ralph Bryan, a longtime New Westminster resident, and Dr. Dave Chisholm, who would soon be heading to Montreal for postgraduate work. Their discussions centered around early transportation routes across North America, the trails, portages, rivers, and lakes, virtually a highway from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and whether the routes could still be followed in a canoe. The idea became a reality, and Ralph and Dave were joined in the canoe by Don McNaughton, a native of Montreal who had the spirit of canoeing in his blood, and by a very experienced canoeist, Jim Reid. The crew was completed when a land support party of Bill Gifford and Lorna and Ido Hemis was organized. The departure date was set, and all that was left was to get in shape both mentally and physically. Today, Ralph Bryan, the driving force behind the Eastward Ho Canoe Trip, is now retired to Galiano Island, and he looks back on the trip as one of the most important events in his life. It was a voyage that was much more to him than 4 men canoeing across Canada. It became a very national and patriotic event, an event which paid tribute to those who traveled the same route many years before.
it was strictly a Canadian show right from beginning to end. I mean, the Indian people, of course, they developed the techniques, and the French people took that and they did the exploration, and they started to, based on the information received from Indians, and they worked their way westward, gradually encompassed the whole breadth of North America. And it was, as far as I know, it's the world's only transcontinental waterway, and it was all done by Canadians, and the Canadians were Indian, and they were French, and they were English and Scottish, and the language of the era was French speaking. They all had to speak French, and but they did it, and it was a Canadian enterprise, and it was one country, and in effect, this route that was established really determined our boundary, our border, ultimately. That's what kept us Canadian, and everything south of the 49th became American. The reason for it, the main reason why, anyhow, was the geography of this particular water route.
Although it would make the trip more difficult, the crew was determined to travel strictly within Canadian borders. It was a route which would follow many rivers, lakes, and valleys, not only east, but also north and south. It was a route not exactly as the crow flies. However, by canoe, this was the only way it could be done. Many historical Canadian explorers, such as Samuel de Champlain and David Thompson, would be proud to know that their self-discovered routes would once again be traveled by canoe. The first part of the trip, originating from New Westminster, was to travel up the Fraser and Columbia rivers. This was to be the first time that anyone had traveled upstream on the rivers by canoe, and certainly proved to be a challenge. It was a sunny morning, April 1st, 1967, when the team prepared to embark on their journey. They left New Westminster with 2,000 canoe mail letters, which equated to an additional 45 pounds, which could not be eaten or used for warmth. But the mail must go through, and if the mail was to make it, then so would the Eastward Ho. The crew received tremendous community support, and it was not long before they said their goodbyes and headed upstream. As they headed off on their trip in 1967, they went off on this part of the Fraser River, a part of the Fraser River that was well known to them, this broad, calm expanse. Wading upriver a short distance was the Fraser Canyon, what was described as their first taste of fear. And in heading through that area, they would be the first group to canoe up the river system. Having an outboard made this part of the trip possible. Of course, using and bringing the motor would later pose other problems, such as having to carry it across their many portages. The route took the men through cities such as Ashcroft and Revelstoke, and included portages past many breathtaking mountainsides and lakes. They encountered some snow along the way, but travels went quite smoothly as the crew reached the end of the Thompson 3 weeks into the voyage.
We sat around last night discussing memories of things of the trip. Almost every memory had something to do with the help we got along the way from people. And one of the highlights of that, I think, was when we were hiking between Sycamoose and Revelstoke over the Eagle Pass there. And a truck went by, a produce truck, and beeped his horn as he went by. But when we got up over the crest of the hill, we could see a piece of cardboard standing up a ways ahead of us. We were walking along the side of the highway, and we got there, and there was a little message. I don't recall the message now, but when we picked it up, there was 4 great big juicy oranges he'd taken out from the back of his truck. It was a hot, sweltering day, and left them under the cardboard for us. And that was the sort of, those little things really mean a lot when you're on a trip like that.
Yes, I think the hardship, I fell in the water with the camera on, in freezing water, and then a blizzard set in when we were going through the Rocky Mountains, transporting our gear and the mail and everything that we were carrying, and they had to get a fire going just to get me dried out to prevent me from getting hypothermia. I think the other episode was carrying or pulling the canoe around the Columbia River and Kinbasket Lake along the old Big Bend Highway, which had been washed out over the years, and hauling the canoe by rope on the snow around that impasse. It was just an incredible day.
The next part of the trip saw the crew cross the Rockies from Moberly to Prince Albert. The first portion through the mountains was to be on foot. In the Rockies, the crew was faced with a whole new set of problems. They now had to, because of the ice and snow, they now had to walk and ski. They had to carry all their material. They had to drag the canoe. They found themselves facing many miles of ice-laden rivers. But they managed through. They walked and they skied to get to that next river system that would now allow them to continue paddling across Canada. In the Rockies, the land party took the canoe and the boat crew walked and skied. Shallow streams were forded with the skis still on to save time, and snow, melted in a pot, formed the liquid for the day's warming soup. A helicopter pilot and his aircraft offered refreshments and an aerial view of their progress, just one of the many kindnesses experienced along the way. At the end of April, they met the Banff-Jasper Highway and the North Saskatchewan River. On this hike, the crew each carried an 80-pound pack, and at one point they followed quite successfully the trail left behind by a cougar. River reports had said it was open all the way, but these reports were wrong, very wrong. There was 50 miles of pack ice on the river. The canoe was dragged most of this over ice and snow, and another week was lost. Finally, Edmonton was reached, where wreaths of welcome and good luck were dropped from a bridge to the canoe. On May 13, they headed off across the prairies towards Prince Albert.
I would say number one was I was amazed the way four guys humped together for all that length of time, and maybe the odd argument, but nothing deep, nothing serious, and we got there and we remained friends ever since. And I think it was quite amazing all the things we went through, and yet there was things that never got bad enough that we had to break up and quit. We carried on with it.
I think being away from my wife and family was probably as difficult as anything I could remember, and the loneliness at times and wondering just why I was doing what I was doing. But the answer was always available when I had a chance to call home and found the support that I needed to continue on. But that was the most difficult part of it.
This part led the crew across the prairie provinces, from Prince Albert, through an area as far north as they would go, through Le Pas, and ending at Winnipeg. At this part of the trip, things began to move a little more smoothly. But then they were faced with something that is just a tremendous frustration. They had to wait. Ice came upon them, and they had to wait. They had to sit. You can imagine killing time when you want to get going. All this was offset, though, by tremendous kindness from the native people of the area, people they stayed with, who took them in as if they were friends. This kind of thing was what made this trip very special. The route across the prairies would take them through their most northerly point, Cumberland House. Cumberland House is a trading post with hundreds of years of history. Here they camped with the native people and shared the river with the flowing ice. At Le Pas, discouragement, as they were forced into an 8-day wait due to the ice. Time was spent playing cards and doing chores, but it was frustrating. It was already the end of May. Half their time was gone. Now they experienced their second spring on the trip. The weather was warming. At Duke Bay on Lake Winnipegosis, they camped with an Indian family. More kindness from total strangers. Lake Manitoba, with a large storm which held them up for 2 days, the Red River, Portage-la-Prairie into Winnipeg. They were now approaching the southwest corner of the Canadian Shield and their trip across Ontario.
I think the highlight was the feeling of, the feeling about Canada as a nation, both geographically as well as the people. And the spirit of the group itself and the support we had. It's hard to identify any single thing, but it's just the overall spirit that went along with the participation. And this is a pervasive feeling you have throughout the years, the 25 years since.
We had our share of hardship. One of the worst days, I think, was just past Drayton Valley. We'd sat there for about 8 days waiting for ice to go off the North Saskatchewan River, and when it finally moved down, we got our canoe in the water and headed out. But we only got a few miles and we caught up to the ice again. And we were in a neck of the river where we couldn't get up on the shore. We had to continue over the ice. And we spent about 8 hours going less than 2 miles, falling through the ice, and it was bitter cold and no way to dry out. We just had to keep working on, and we knew we weren't going to meet up with anybody. We weren't on any our schedule at that point. But that was a tough time, but they don't seem tough anymore looking back at it. It's all good memories.
Here at the edge of the Canadian Shield, under Hudson's Bay, they moved from Winnipeg to the broad, stormy waters of Lake Superior. Here below Hudson's Bay, they went from portage to portage, relatively easy, on their way to what would be perhaps the most difficult part of the trip, the most physically demanding part, and that was Lake Superior. Lake Superior is more than just a lake. It's like an inland ocean. And when they crossed it, imagine in this open boat, open to the wind, open to the weather, open to extreme cold, this was the part of the trip that truly was the most stressful part. From Manitoba, through Lake of the Woods and the Rainy River, they headed out on this historic route close by the border. At Fort Frances, they visited the reminders of earlier adventurers. The route to Grand Portage and Lake Superior had 65 portages, the longest 2 miles, others through residential districts and small towns. Lake Superior now lay ahead. Lake Superior was the most physically stressful portion of the Eastward Ho trip. 420 miles across the open lake, open to the wind and bone-chilling cold. In time, the lake passed, and the crew was warmed by the welcome and hospitality at Sault Ste. Marie. Now, you're from Quebec.
I'm from Quebec. I grew up in the eastern townships, about 100 miles east of Montreal, on the St. Francis River, which I used to canoe in. And I always had a thrill about the voyageurs, because, you know, in Quebec, the history of the area was colored by the events of the voyageurs. And as a youngster, the teachers that I had in school were always telling us about the stories of Canada's exploration by the voyageurs, and people such as Ralph mentioned, Samuel de Champlain, La André, and of course Mackenzie and Simon Fraser and David Thompson. So that it was really very special for me when Ralph, you know, suggested that we do this, and I said, well, it's a nice cheap way to get back to Quebec. And that I enjoyed.
The last part of the trip, on to Montreal, was through routes of vast historical importance. It was also a time of renewed enthusiasm as the expedition's conclusion was drawing near. Now they were nearing the end of the trip. They could see that the goal that they had been seeking was in sight. They had endured numerous hardships, traveled thousands of miles, and ahead of them they still had rapids and portages and many rivers to canoe, but now they knew they were going to make it. Imagine the energy that comes from that. All that space, all that time, and now you know that your goal is in sight. The Eastward Ho canoe trip will be a success. After Sault Ste. Marie, the Canadian lock lowered them 25 feet past the rapids on the St. Mary's River and past a marker dedicated to earlier voyageurs. They now moved quickly and relatively easily. The weather was warm. Lake Huron, Georgian Bay, French River, the Ottawa River to the Mattawa. It was all downhill to Montreal from this point. July 2nd, they reached the headwaters of the Mattawa in its 7 portages. There was 150 miles to go. At Ottawa, 4,000 canoe miles from New Westminster, they enjoyed the changing of the guard and took time to visit a memorial to Samuel de Champlain, the first man to send explorers into the wilderness. Their last landfall, the marina at Expo 67 in Montreal, brought their epic canoe adventure to a close. Family, friends, and enthusiastic Canadians welcomed them to shore. Their last responsibility, delivering the mail to the Montreal post office, completed, they could now relax. Their work was done. The trip, 3.5 months by canoe. The return by air would take 5.5 hours. On Saturday, April 4, 1992, the Eastward Ho canoe went on display at Westminster Quay. This long-term display of the canoe was arranged by the Quay and the New Westminster Museum, where the boat had been on exhibit since November of 1967. The presentation of the canoe and the people involved was dedicated not only to the 25th anniversary of the feat, but to Canada in this year of Canada's 125th anniversary. The trip showed that Canada was strong, its people excited by their past and looking to their future. The crew of the Eastward Ho canoe and their support party found that the highlight over all of the adventure was meeting people along the way and their unselfish kindness towards the travelers. The Eastward Ho canoe is symbolic of the nation that is Canada.
For Eastward Ho, the enthusiasm and generosity of people along the way was overwhelming. Hearts and homes opened to us everywhere on our 4,000 miles of travel. To our surprise, we became aware of another Canada, one far removed from the screaming headlines of hyperbole that magnified the entrenched positions of political parties or the belligerent stances of self-seeking pressure groups, factors which tend to divide this country. Instead, we encountered a quiet, deep feeling of national pride. Those we talked to were pleased to be part of the whole and desirous of some accommodation for other Canadians as they went about their own daily business. This attitude was as true in Quebec as it was in British Columbia. Perhaps we met the silent majority, whose thoughts are seldom heard. Yours truly, the Eastward Ho Canoe Expedition, Canoe Crew, Ralph Bryan, David Chisholm, Don McNaughton, Jim Reed, Land Party, Phil Gifford, Ido Hemis, Lorna Hemis. Thank you.
For those who were on hand for the event, it was an important opportunity to recognize the Eastward Ho crew and also to discuss the importance of Canadian unity.
As the fellows themselves explained, they saw a different Canada, and they've met people who want to keep Canada together. And I don't know how, if we could just repeat this kind of thing, we might be able to just accomplish that. I think this is tremendous. You know, 25 years ago they really did something, and there's still that spirit in this country.
I worry about Canada, frankly, but I'm always pleased to see this kind of memory kept alive. It's unifying. It's fun.
I believe that the ordinary, everyday citizen still believes in Canada. I don't think this media coverage that they're exploding this thing, I don't think it applies at all.
This is the real Canadian we've got here today.
This is the real Canadian. Yes. This is us.
I don't know about you, but I'm very proud to be a Canadian. I think the people that we've seen today on this program, the people who made this trip 25 years ago, definitely have that pride in their country. A display like the Eastward Ho canoe display at Westminster Quay gives you an opportunity to learn about part of Canada's history, part of our local history. But it definitely gives you a chance to understand more about our past. If you're interested in local history or the history of Canada, the history of what British Columbia means to Canada and vice versa, then do call us at the New Westminster Museum. We're always very pleased to help. We must thank the people of Eastward Ho, those people that 25 years ago paddled and drove and worked and dragged and skied and hiked their way across Canada for us. I mean, they were doing it for themselves, sure, they enjoyed it, but they were doing it for all Canadians to show that Canadians had this kind of spirit. So our thanks must go to them. I trust that you have perhaps learned a little more about Canadian history. Perhaps this program will spur you on to try to find out some more. I'm Archie Miller. Thank you for watching.